It's Friday, May 23rd, 2025. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Granthermes. 2 weeks ago, President Donald Trump went into the Oval Office and made an announcement that he said was as big as it gets, that he wanted to lower the price of prescription drugs in the U.S. by 50 to 80 to 90% in some cases, is what he said. And he wanted to do that through something called Most Favored Nations status. It's the idea that he could force pharmaceuticals to sell their drugs and medicines here in the U.S. for the same price as they're selling it as the lowest price somewhere else in the world. And in the episode Drugs and Deals from just 2 weeks ago, I talked about how economists say that that's not really how things work, and in fact, it might make things worse. But it does feel intuitive, right? That the drugs are made here in the U.S., we subsidize those pharmaceutical companies, we pay them taxes, they pay taxes here, and then we don't get the benefit of those being made here. It's why I turned to an economist from Yale named Jason Abaluck, who specializes in this exact thing. And we talk all about why those intuitive understandings that this sounds like a good deal actually aren't, for a lot of reasons that have to do with things other than money, which I think is an interesting thing that gets lost when we talk about big pharma, capital B, capital P. And it was an eye-opening conversation, for me at least, to understand how this stuff works, how intricate all of this is, and frankly, how well things are working right now, even if drug prices are too high in the U.S. And now I do want to say that we talked 2 weeks ago. So this was before this week's giant passage of the Republican One Big Beautiful Bill and didn't have any of those Medicaid cuts in there. So we don't talk about that. And that will certainly affect how the U.S. has any negotiating leverage when it comes to drug prices. But I still think that this conversation with Jason is worth your time because it challenges some of the things that we think should make sense on their face when it comes to lowering drug prices. Now, before we get to that, make sure that you're following and subscribe to the podcast on whatever app you use, subscribe on YouTube, and sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I've got great new content going up there all the time. It is just $5 a month to get that stuff for paid subscribers. Subscriptions start at $5 and go up from there. And if you don't want to do that, no problem. But please share the show on social media. It's Mims News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. Okay, let's get to my conversation with Yale economist Jason Abaluck. And so the reason I reached out to you in the first place is because I saw your thread on X where it was like this fun thing that was like, two things happened today at this announcement. I get to talk about the thing that no one ever wants to talk to me about. And two, this might be bad policy. But yes, let's start with what the idea of most favored nations actually is, because this is a thing that Trump mentioned. He mentioned it a couple times. He mentioned it during his first term. And it's not, I would say, like an obscure poli-sci term, but it's definitely not one that's rolling around in a lot of people's heads. So what is this?
Okay, so very good question. So an MFN is basically an agreement where one party says, look, there's other people who buy stuff from you and they pay you for that thing, and I don't want to pay any more than those other people pay. Okay, so you see MFN sometimes in the private sector. You've also seen it previously from the government. So for example, Medicaid has an agreement where when they buy drugs, Medicaid says, pharmaceutical companies, you sell drugs to other insurers. We are not going to pay much more than the other insurers pay for these drugs. And so, it seems, without thinking about it too hard, like this would be maybe a decent way of keeping prices down. Like if you're a consumer and you're buying something and you're like, oh, great, I'm getting the best deal that anyone gets anywhere. It sounds pretty good on its face.
It sounds good. And it's not just drug prices. This happens in a lot of other parts of the economy, right?
Exactly. So people offer deals like this all the time. And now, one thing that has happened, by the way, is for some of the reasons that we'll get into, is these kinds of deals have drawn a lot of regulatory scrutiny. So when private companies do these deals, so like an insurer like Blue Cross Blue Shield makes a deal like this with, let's say, hospitals, where they say, sure, we'll pay you a fee, but we don't want to pay you a higher fee than United or Humana than all these other insurers pay. So those deals have actually often been subject to antitrust lawsuits. So you might say, oh, it seems like it's a good idea, but also it seems like something can go wrong. And so we'll try to get into why that is.
Well, let's get into why that is. So, because I guess the idea of MFN, and for the listeners, we're just going to use that kind of throughout this thing instead of saying the full term. Yeah. It has this air about it that is like the market will regulate it itself through MFNs.
Yeah.
But when you bring up the antitrust stuff, that's clearly not happening. So why isn't that the case?
Okay. So first, let's talk about the public sector one, where it's just like Medicaid does something like this. And so there's kind of an obvious way in which this can backfire, which basically Medicaid says, okay, I'm not going to pay a higher price than any of the other insurers pay for these drugs. And then the pharmaceutical company has two choices. They can either say, okay, we are going to lower the price that we charge to Medicaid. We're going to get less money from them. Or they can say, we're going to raise the price that we charge to everyone else. Now, either way, the pharmaceutical company arguably, so you might think that maybe they're losing even by raising the price to everyone else, because it's like they were trying to negotiate the best price they can from their perspective. They're trying to profit maximize. So it's not like they obviously want to do either, but you have to consider how much do they lose in each case, right? And that's going to depend on how big is Medicaid compared to these other insurers. So if, let's say, the lowest price that they were charging, there happens to be one insurer in South Dakota they were giving a really great deal to, and they have a choice, or they can either raise the price to this one insurer in South Dakota, or they can lower the price dramatically for all the Medicaid people. Well, they're going to raise the price to the one insurer in South Dakota. And there's good evidence of this. This is what happened when Medicaid rolled out their MFN. This happened in the 1990s. What happened was they didn't suddenly say, all the pharmaceutical companies weren't like, oh, we'll suddenly dramatically lower the price we'll charge to Medicaid. They just raised the prices that they were charging to the people who were previously getting the best.
So instead of it being a good deal for those people, it's a worse deal for them, but it's a better.
Well, it's a worse deal for everyone. So in other words, Medicaid, it basically didn't make much difference, but the other people kind of got screwed, right? So Medicaid, it's like the prices are about the same, but then there were these other insurers that were previously getting a better deal than Medicaid. And now Medicaid said, we're going to tie the price we pay to those other insurers. And so the pharmaceutical company said, okay, well, we'll raise the price to the other insurers. Now imagine that we do this with countries where the US says, okay, well, we're not going to pay any more than Turkey pays. And Turkey is the OECD country maybe with the lowest drug prices. So they pay about 1/10 what the United States typically pays.
Wow.
Right? So now you're a pharmaceutical company. You could say, I could lower prices to the United States, which is 40% of my global revenue, or I could raise prices to Turkey, which is, 0.1%, some negligible fraction of my global revenue. And they're going to say, well, okay, I'll raise prices to Turkey, right? And they're not going to lower prices in the United States very much. And now things get a little bit more complicated if instead of doing the United States and Turkey, it's like the United States and Canada, for example, where Canada is much smaller than the United States, but not so small that it could be completely ignored. So in that case, what would happen is if the US had an MFN just with Canada, what would probably happen is prices in the US would fall a tiny bit and prices in Canada would rise enormously. Whereas with Turkey, it's like prices in the US won't fall at all because they'll just raise prices.
Well, so then the fact that the president is saying like drug prices are going to fall, 30 to 80% for US, that's just not the case. That's not how this has been borne out in the past.
An MFN will not accomplish that. Now, so one thing that is true is when, you see a tweet or whatever, what will the actual policy look like? There are lots of things the actual policies could look like. There are things the government could do if the government wanted to lower drug prices, and we will get to whether that is a good idea or not. But if that were the goal, the government can basically just kind of centrally negotiate or basically say to the drug companies, look, here's what we're paying for these prices. So it is not beyond the power of Congress and the president together to basically dramatically lower drug prices in this way. And MFN alone will not accomplish that.
So then why do this? I mean, like the president, while has his ideas about wanting to be a dude who like just does stuff, right? like does have people who are serious economic people around him. Whether or not they're acting or behaving seriously right now is a different thing. But like there are people around there who know this. So like what is the point of doing this then if there's good evidence to say that it just won't do what they're saying it's going to do?
Well, first, I think it's transparently clear that the people who are serious economists are marginalized in terms of decision making. And this is something where until like a couple of months ago or whatever, it's something that you would guess. But we now have extremely good evidence of this, which is we saw the specific formula that was used to determine the tariff rates that were set by the administration. And when you actually looked at the formula, it's a formula that like economists would look at it and be like, oh, this is incoherent nonsense. Like it was sort of a formula that was wrong in two different respects. It was wrong in terms of like it was set in such a way as to minimize what are called like bilateral trade deficits between countries, that's just an insane thing to try to minimize in the first place. And second of all, the formula was wrong in that they calibrated the parameters incorrectly in order to try to minimize this thing. They misunderstood several of the papers they were citing and they picked the wrong thing. And so probably what happened is a non-economist like asked GPT or something like this, and by the way, I think GPT in 2 years will be very good at this, but nowadays it's not so good at this. And so what is very clear, though, is that the actual policies that are coming out of this administration are not policies that were developed by serious economists or something like that. It's something where, for whatever reason, they decided those people aren't worth listening to, and they're going to do things based on other political considerations.
Right. I think it was Wired or maybe 404 Media who actually did a whole thing about when that equation came out. They were like, we tried and ChatGPT spit out this exact same thing and almost word for word like what the administration said. So, I mean, like as an economist, and we'll get back to what we were talking about, I'm really sorry, but like as an economist, are you just pulling your hair out right now watching some of this stuff happen, with whether it's with the tariffs or whether it's with this MFN policy?
No, but only because I'm very worried about like losing my hair. Like, so I would try to react in other ways that didn't involve like going bald faster.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get back to this thing. So why have this drug policy? Why take this approach if, obviously you said serious people are on the sidelines, but like it won't work.
I honestly think what the rationale is that this is a very intuitive thing if you're not an economist and you don't have the right tools for thinking through what to do. Like if you just talk to the average person on the street and you say, hey, doesn't it seem unfair that people in the United States pay a lot more for drugs than people in other countries, including other rich countries? And a person on the street would say, yeah, that does seem really unfair. And then you say, how about we pass a law that says we're not going to do that anymore? And a person on the street would be like, that seems like a really good idea to me. Right. And I think, obviously, if you're not like a technocratic person who has worked through the mathematics of what is going to happen in equilibrium when you do this policy, if you don't have a specific model of the behavior of the pharmaceutical company and how they're setting prices, it will seem like a good idea to you. And I'm sure that is what led people. And to be clear, by the way, before the Trump administration did this has been floated in many previous administrations. But I'm sure what happened is in the previous administrations, the political people floated it because they were like, hey, we talked to people. Everyone loves this. This is the most popular idea in the world. And then they ran it by the economists, and the economists were like, oh, no, you shouldn't do that. And then they were like, you economists, like, do you really have our best interests at heart? Do you really care about the person on Main Street? And they were like, no, you shouldn't do this. Everyone will be harmed. And in the previous administration, they gave enough deference. They didn't always listen to economists, but they gave enough deference to them that they were like, okay, we shouldn't do the policies that the economists say are just completely horrible.
Before we kind of get into what this would mean on a much larger global scale, is because we're talking about tagging and setting our prices on other countries' prices, which also have a major macro problem. Talk to me about how drug prices actually work right now. I did an episode earlier this week that was explained sort of that there's, the insurance knock-on effect of it in this from the pharmaceutical companies that are a lot of them based in the US, and there's a lot of moving parts to this, but how does this actually work?
Yes, so that's a very good question. It works very differently in the United States than many other countries. So in many other countries, what you essentially have is some kind of national health service that is coming in and saying, okay, we're going to hire a bunch of scientists and they're going to look at each drug and then they're going to decide based on the value of the drug how much our health system should pay for that drug. Okay. In the United States, what we have is, instead of having the government essentially set the prices for drugs, we have private insurers who negotiate the prices of drugs. And that's even oversimplifying, because the private insurers actually get together a little bit in these organizations called PBMs, pharmacy benefit managers, who work on behalf of a consortium of private insurers and negotiate the price with each pharmaceutical company.
It's their smoky back room of insurance companies, basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Although if they smoked, they would have to pay higher insurance premiums. So they might be very sensitive to that. But they're negotiating the drug price. But there's the PBMs that are then negotiating on behalf of the insurance companies. And so one way this differs is the PBMs have sort of less negotiating power than a government would, because a government can just say, or especially at least the US government, because we're so big, can say, here's the price we're going to pay and you can't disagree. Now, the government of Turkey can't say that, because if the government of Turkey said that, the pharmaceutical company would be like, well, we're out of here. We're just not going to, if you pay us too little and it's tied to the price in the US, we're just going to leave, right? They can't leave the US because the US is so big. So the US government can basically unilaterally just set the prices of drugs if they want. The PBMs can't do that, because the PBMs, if they said, what is their threat point? Their threat point is, so they're negotiating with the pharmaceutical companies, and the pharmaceutical company says, pay us a ton of money for this drug. And the PBM says, no. Well, if they say no, they're not going to be able to cover that drug. And then consumers might want to go to different insurance companies. Okay. They have some negotiating power, because if the pharmaceutical company is insisting that it's such a high price everywhere, none of the insurers would cover it. But they have much less negotiating power than the government. And what that means is that the outcome of this negotiation is typically higher prices than if the government just stepped in and set those prices.
So why doesn't the government just step in then?
Okay.
Why aren't they doing it here?
So there are two versions of your question, which is, one question is, what are the politics of why this hasn't happened? A second question is, should this happen? So which do you want to talk about first? Do you want to talk about the one question, which I could speculate about, is the politics?
Yeah, go for it.
That there's a number of factors. Probably the foremost among them is that many really large pharmaceutical companies are based in the United States, especially the ones that sell branded drugs. So companies that sell generic drugs historically are based in Europe, but companies that sell, come up with new therapies typically are based in the United States. So of course they have a lot of political power, and they would lose a lot of money if the government were to just step in and say the price is going to be lower.
Right. And then that, which almost seems like the simpler answer to these questions, because the next question is, should this happen? And
okay. Well, hold on. But now we might be a little bit surprised by this, because what most economists would say is, I think, the opposite of what the average person thinks. Okay. So the people who study this issue say, on the one hand, prices are really high in the United States. That is undoubtedly true compared to other countries. On the other hand, there is something really, really good that you get when you have high pharmaceutical prices, which are, you get drugs. It turns out if you have high pharmaceutical prices, pharmaceutical companies want to develop more therapies. And it turns out that the value of drugs is extremely, extremely high. So there are some drugs that are really, really, really good. So things like, Ozempic is the most recent example, which is just an absolute miracle. There are things like statins, various immunizations, the various treatments that we've developed for HIV. These treatments have saved hundreds of millions of lives and have dramatically extended many other lives. Like, the value of these is astronomical. So if you were to change policy in a way that you dramatically slowed the development of new drugs, that could be very bad. There is an interesting calculation, and then we'll come back to what the right policy is. So, but first, let me just try to help people understand the magnitude of why pharmaceutical innovation is really important. So there was one calculation, there was a study from Rand that's probably like now 10 or 15 years old, but basically they did the following calculation. They said, on the one hand, we have good estimates from a bunch of papers by economists about, if pharmaceutical companies make more money, how many more drugs do we get? So economists like to try to figure this out. And we have a bunch of different, what we call natural experiments to try to figure this out, where we see the introduction of Medicare Part D made certain drugs much more profitable, or certain drugs for certain conditions much more profitable. Do we get many more drugs for those conditions? Yes, we do. So they said, here's how many more drugs we get if we were to, for example, keep the current prices versus lower prices by 20%. Here's how many more drugs we get. Then they multiplied that by the value of those drugs as assessed from clinical trials. Okay, so they said we get X number more drugs times the value. What is the total value of the new drugs that are created by having pharmaceutical prices at the current level rather than 20% lower? And so they said, okay, imagine you're a generation that's born, around the year 2000, and then you're something like, 55 years old in 2055. And what they said was, based on their estimates, that those people would, on average, live 0.7 years longer. Now, is that a lot? Is that a little? You're like, 0.7 years doesn't sound like that big a deal, right? So how many people will there be on Earth at that time? We don't know how fertility is going to work out, AI, whatever. Let's just say 10 billion. I'll just guess it, right? 10 billion people times 0.7 years would be 7 billion life years. Now, what is 7 billion life years? Let's think about some things that people think are bad, like World War II. So World War II, there was the Holocaust where, 6 million Jews died. There were 12 million people who were killed in the Holocaust. There were about 80 million people, civilians, military, who died as a result of World War II. It was probably the most catastrophic thing, arguably the Black Plague. The Black Plague or World War II were the two worst things that happened in human history. Okay, so that's 80 million people. If you take 80 million people, you multiply by like 30 years, that's about the number of life years they lost, you get 2.4 billion life years. So what I just told you is if you lowered drug prices by 20%, it would be 3 times worse than the worst thing that ever happened in human history.
That's wild. That's insane.
Okay. So now let me tell you some assumptions that there's a lot of speculative elements of that calculation.
Yeah.
It's not clear that calculation is exactly correct, but what this calculation does illustrate is they did some reasonable stuff and they said it's 3 times worse than the worst thing that ever happened in human history, right? So the big thing there's 2 big things that might be false about this. One question is, how do future drugs relate to past drugs? Maybe future drugs are less valuable, but maybe future drugs are even more valuable because it's the future. Science is better. Okay. Another big thing, the distinction economists would make is between the average drug and the marginal drug. So what do we mean by that? So if you look across every drug, some drugs are super duper valuable. So the average drug looks really good, but it might be that if you lower prices by 20%, you still get Ozempic and you still get, drugs to treat erectile dysfunction, which happen to be enormously valuable, right? Like if you think about the value that these drugs should generate. So you still get these home runs. And then you have these other drugs where it's like, it's kind of a copycat, or we're not sure if it's very effective. It extends life in people who have terminal cancer by a month or whatever. And we don't really care that much. Maybe what happens is if you lower price by 20%, you mostly lose the drugs that are like maybe not that valuable. So there's various reasons you could think one or the other. The short answer is we really don't know. Okay. So if we did that, we would be really gambling on, we could be doing something absolutely terrible. Now, that said, I have just told you that the average, we might not want to lower drug price on average by 20%. This does not mean that the price of every drug is correct. There are all kinds of specific problems that economists point to where we're like, oh, this class of drugs, the price is way too high. And this class of drugs, the price is way too low. And we should do something about that. So I'm not saying every complaint about how high drug price is wrong. Like people who are like insulin, the price too high, they're probably correct, right? But there are, if we were to just say, let's lower drug prices by fiat by 20%, that might be really bad.
There is an overall cost to that and an innovation cost to that. I think when people think about this too, and I mean, I certainly had this as you were talking just now, how come it has to be the US to do this? Is part of this thing, why does that have to be done here?
So let's come back to the MFN and then let's engage directly with your question.
Absolutely.
Okay, so the first thing is, I told you earlier, I was like, hey, the MFN is going to raise the prices paid by Canada and by Turkey and by Europe. And given the thing I just said a moment ago, shouldn't we be like, this is terrific? Because innovation is so valuable. If we raise the price, we get more innovation and isn't that good. And the problem is we've missed something. Because if we go to Turkey and we take Turkey and we raise the price by a factor of 10, pharmaceutical revenue in Turkey does not go up. The problem is Turkey would consume a lot fewer drugs, and probably by more than a factor of 10 if the price increased by a factor of 10, because what economists call the price elasticity in Turkey, if you guys, for those that, in your audience who have taken a microeconomics class, right? The price elasticity is too big. So what would happen in Turkey is pharmaceutical revenues would fall. Now, if pharmaceutical revenues fall, that means they have even less incentive for innovation. So this is a lose-lose. What the policy does is it raises prices, makes it harder for those people to get drugs, and it reduces pharmaceutical revenue. Why does it reduce pharmaceutical revenue? Aren't they trying to profit maximize? Yes, they're trying to profit maximize, but you force them to set a price that is way, way above what would be the profit maximizing level in Turkey, because they tied it to the US.
And the idea of elasticity is literally like you're stretching somebody's budgetary rubber band past the point where it can stretch and it snaps.
Yes. Well, you mixing metaphors. Yes. I keep every time you try to use any kind of metaphor, I either jokingly or literally have been disputing it. But so yes, no, that's absolutely the problem in Turkey, which is you raise the price too much, and that they would consume less.
They just can't do it. So then, the question here again is: can the innovation still happen without doing this, and can we get prices to where they are, or is this just too big of a task at this point? Is the horse out of the barn?
Let's come to what do we want to do now, right? We said, okay, you don't want to maybe lower total pharmaceutical revenue, but you also don't want to raise the price in the other countries via this MFN so much that you're both compromising access and lowering revenue. So what would we like to do? So there's a number of things that we could do. So first of all, the idea of, and actually there's one more piece of context that is needed here. So it is certainly correct that the US, by paying high prices, is subsidizing other countries, because all the other countries are beneficiaries of the innovation that comes from high price in the US. So you might be like, why does the US have to bear a disproportionate share of this? So a first thing to note is, well, there's other ways that other countries are subsidizing the US. For example, other countries hold a disproportionate share of US securities. And without getting into what securities are and how all of economics works or whatever, but the fact that other countries like to hold dollars and like to hold US securities and bonds and things means that when the US pays interest on our debt, we end up with much lower interest rates than we otherwise would. They're implicitly subsidizing us by doing it. Now, they might have good reasons for doing it in their own right, but there's all kinds of ways that countries implicitly subsidize one another across different domains. So in my view, it would be a very big mistake to insist that in every domain, we have to make the net subsidy zero, one domain at a time. What we want to look at is the big picture. We want to look at, there's these ways the US is subsidizing other countries, there's other ways they're subsidizing us. Are we getting a fair deal, all things considered? That's a reasonable question to ask. Okay. What we don't want to do is be like, oh, let's insist that things break even on farm, and let's insist that things break even in the bond market, and let's insist that things break even in every market. And then you end up causing all kinds of distortions to make everyone poor. Okay. So, all right. Now that said, you might still say, well, all right, with that caveat in mind, let's still try to make other countries bear a little bit more of the burden for drugs. And you could do that. Like Trump could go, or the US government could go to the European Union and say, look, we want you to pay a higher price for drugs. Don't do that via an MFN, because it'll also compromise pharma company revenues. It'll end up with a price way above the price that maximizes pharma company revenues. But you could say, look, we want you to pay a little bit more, and we're going to lower our prices in a way that keeps global revenues about the same. And that would be a reasonable negotiation to have. Don't do it via an MFN.
Right. And it also doesn't really seem like that's the one he wants to have right now either, given the policies that he's been laying out.
Right. Oh, no. Again, you would need a fair amount of economic sophistication to sort of understand why you want to do one thing rather than the other. And it's pretty clear, I'm sure Trump personally thinks he understands these things, but obviously he doesn't have that economic model in his head that would lead him to arrive at what the right policy solution is.
Sure. There's a thing too that as we've been talking about this, I've been it's come up in my head a couple times, and I've thought about this as I've been researching this too, is that when we talk about this MFN policy cutting down on innovation, and you dovetail that with things like cuts to the NIH, which does do a lot of these things, what does that do combined to the economics of the drug industry in the US, which is a significant industry, regardless of how people feel about big pharma, it's significant.
And I wouldn't even frame it that way just because people will get the wrong idea. If you frame it as like the economics of the drug industry, people are like, oh, these poor pharmaceutical executives, they might suffer because you're doing this. Like, the reason the drug industry is big is because, like, when you get heart disease or cancer, you get medications that help you live rather than die. And that is very good. What you want is when you get sick, you want to live rather than die. So that is what we are talking about here, not whether, the poor drug industry, like, of course, you're totally correct in what you described, that it's it would impact the drug industry. But just in terms of understanding the consequences, what it is impacting is when you get sick, are there medical treatments that will make you healthy again, or will you be in persistent pain and then die? And if you've ever been sick, hopefully you prefer the world where there are medical treatments that make you better instead of you are in persistent pain and then die. Okay, so now let us talk about what the consequences for that are. So when we talk about NIH funding, so the NIH does many different things. The NIH sometimes it funds economists, sometimes it funds chemists, sometimes it funds biologists, sometimes it funds people developing drugs. About 5% of the budget of the NIH is devoted towards things that are really precursors to drug development directly. Okay. So people have estimated the return to that spending. They said, how many new drugs do we get as a result of NIH spending? When they estimate the return to that spending, what they find is each dollar of NIH spending leads to about $1.40 worth of new drugs. Now you might say, well, okay, seems pretty good. A 40% return on a financial market, that's really good, right? If I get a 40% return, but $1.40 on a dollar, that's not that big a deal, right? But remember what I just said. I just said that 5% of NIH funding is towards this research. That 5% justifies 140% of the entire budget of the NIH, assuming that everything else the NIH does is worthless. Now, I don't think everything else the NIH does is worthless. Some of what the NIH does is fund my own research, but I'm not talking about the value of that. I'm talking about the value of just that 5%, which more than justifies the entire NIH budget. So if you are cutting by half the NIH budget, if you are compromising in any way, and you are, the 5% that goes towards drug development, this is really, really bad. And why is it really, really bad? For the reason that we talked about a few minutes ago, which is drugs are, by and large, really, really good. If you were like, hey, by the way, you have a disease, I have bad news for you. You can only be treated by stuff that was available in 1960. Like if you were kind of like a cynic or whatever, you might be like, oh, the medical system, there's so much waste. I don't care. It's going to be so much cheaper. I'm only going to get 1960 stuff. And you would be able to maintain that illusion until you actually were sick. And then the doctor was like, oh, yeah, we have a drug that would make you better, but we're not going to give it to you because it only was developed later, right? So drugs are really good. And when people don't trust the people who say that drugs are not good, because as soon as you get sick, if you understand, if you take a drug and feel bad, you'll be like, oh, wait a minute. Okay, drugs are good.
If the White House follows through with this, because there's a conversation to be had too, that this is a thing that gets announced and then never comes to fruition because the drug companies push back enough, whether that's in court or whether that's through other channels, and we can talk about that too. But there is this thing that do insurers, do hospitals, do patients directly start turning to other places that maybe don't have the same quality controls on these drugs because of this policy? Do you start to see different markets react differently because of things like this?
Okay, so that's a very good. So let's talk about what would happen in the US and what would happen in other countries. So a thing that I've sort of glossed over is what we might call the strategic responses, both of pharmaceutical companies and of many other agents to a policy like this. So I was sort of like, look, in Turkey, they're just going to stop getting drugs, but that's oversimplified. What's really going to happen is the pharmaceutical companies will try to respond to this policy by first, they're going to try to make it seem like they're going to develop like molecules that are kind of similar, but they're going to say they're not the same drug, right? So to the degree that they can avert the policy, it's probably good because the policy is bad. So it's like they're going to try to do all these things they can to try to make the policy not bind on them to the degree that, and then people are going to, in Turkey, you used to get drugs in this packaging with this name. Now you get drugs in that packaging with that name. And it's kind of similar. And hopefully some people figure it out. And a bunch of stuff like that will happen. And that will mitigate the bad impacts of the MFN. So it will prevent the policy from working as intended, which is good because if the policy works as intended, it backfires.
Is that a likely outcome of this thing, do you think?
I think if you had an MFN, yes. So there's very good evidence. Europe actually did something not the same, but there's a closely related policy called parallel trade. Parallel trade is what happens when, imagine in the US, we just said, look, you can buy drugs in Canada. Okay. It's not quite the same as an MFN, but it has a lot of the same features of an MFN in terms of being like, well, why would I pay the high price in the US if I can pay the lower price in Canada? And now the pharmaceutical company has to equalize prices. So the European Union did this. Okay. And when the European Union did this and said, we're going to allow parallel trade within the European Union, what you saw was, well, prices went up in the countries where previously prices were lower, but also there was all these like diffusion of, it's like you would change the packaging, you would make it harder to buy drugs in a poor country and then import it, and you change the delivery. Like previously it was a pill, now it's a cream and stuff like that, so people don't recognize it. So there's all kinds of things the pharma companies would do to try to make parallel trade or MFNs more difficult.
Does this even go through? Given everything you just said, given that these pharmaceutical companies know this, other countries know this, insurers know this, hospitals know this, does this even go through? Are there overarching economic forces that are stopgaps for this?
Now you're asking me a question where I don't really have expertise, but let me tell you some of the relevant factors, which are, so, I mean, one question, which is like purely a legal question. Imagine this was like an executive order, but there were no congressional legislation associated with it. What power would it have? Who knows? Like, I don't know. We could talk to lawyers, and I'm sure that probably there will be some disagreement among them about like whether you can do anything like this via executive.
Right. I mean, it didn't work last time, right? It got stopped in courts in 2020.
Yeah, exactly. So, if there were congressional legislation accompanying this, then I think it would have bite. Would that actually happen? And the first thing I would say is when people make confident predictions about political things like this, you shouldn't trust them. That there's just politics are uncertain and dynamic. And, maybe what's going to happen is someone will see this podcast and a reporter will say to Trump, someone on a podcast said you were an idiot because you want to do an MFN. And Trump will say, what do you mean? I'm a genius. We need to do an MFN. That is now my policy priority. And then he will very strongly push Congress to do that. And that will happen. Everything depends on just this random stuff about who personally feels slighted, how much they decide to prioritize things. I don't think there's like a theory, if you ever read there's the Foundation novels, which are like these Isaac Asimov novels about, there's something called psychohistory, where basically the idea was, he just has these equations that are just going to predict exactly sort of the long run impacts of different political forces. And it's like, no, probably things just depend too much on a bunch of random stuff, and you can't really do that.
Right. Are there, I guess this is the question I should have asked you just beforehand. Are there economic canaries in the coal mine, to just keep throwing metaphors at you?
I know. Is there a canary?
Are there markers, are there signs to watch for that maybe as the White House continues to roll this thing out, as they plan to do, that it's not working as they're saying, or that you can start to see, like I said, traces or markers of things pushing back?
So I think if the policy actually was passed in some way that there was actually bite, so the question is, would it lead them to change course? And my answer is actually probably not, because most of the harms would be borne by other countries. Now, obviously, those other countries would push back against the United States. If the United States does something that unilaterally harms lots of other countries, you would think that if the United States was being completely rational, they would say, we shouldn't do those things, because in fact, we could do better for ourselves by growing the size of the pie between all the countries and then negotiating for a larger share of that pie, as opposed to shrinking the pie and then like arguing over the scraps. That's what we would do if we were rational. But of course, there are many policies that are pursued that are not rational in that respect. And, the tariffs and trade policy are a good example of that. So, and there's been there's been pushback against that. And I think it's been rescinded to some degree. So there's some give, but I think it's possible to impose a lot of harm on other countries without the U.S. internalizing that.
The last question here, and it's a common theme throughout kind of everybody I talk to, no matter what I'm talking to them about, is there is going to be a world post these policy priorities. There is. And assuming that they go through with what they want in the way that they want it, in that world after this, are things too broken to undo them? Does the macroeconomics of drug pricing change so much that we can't go back to zero?
Yeah. That's a very interesting question. And there are contexts where, economists talk about, there's in a very different context, there's something called like hysteresis, where it's like, oh, you break labor markets in a way that it leads to like persistent long-term impacts. And I mean, I think what is certainly true is that like for many decades after, people would feel the negative impacts, although what they would feel is just that they could have had a bunch of drugs that would be really great, and those drugs wouldn't be there. That is the main thing that they would feel in the US. In other countries, there would just be this immediate harm that was done to people's health. But I think, a new administration comes in, or this administration wants to reverse that policy. I think they could do it. They couldn't undo all the harms that were done. But I think it would be possible to just say, oh, we're getting rid of this. We're going back to something like the status quo before the MFN. If you had a more, I think what would be more likely, by the way, is some kind of, instead of going back to the status quo before the MFN, there would be some negotiation where it's like, oh, the US ends up paying a little bit less, and other countries also would, or less than they do now, but other countries would pay less than they would under the MFN, and you would arrive at some new thing.
Some sort of equilibrium in that, but there'd still be pain along the way.
The policy still would have created problems both in the present and in the future, and there would have been many years where pharma companies would have been pursuing novel therapies that would have been valuable that they wouldn't then pursue.
I will say this conversation has made me feel like I need to go stock up on some of the medicine that I have. But Jason, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. I think it really helped me wrap my head around this, and I think it's going to help a lot of people because this is complicated and it's not directly intuitive for most people, myself included. So really, thank you so much.
Yeah, I think this was really fun. Thank you.
I want to thank Jason for coming on the show again. I thought it was a really great conversation, and I hope you did too. You can find links to all the great work and research he's doing at Yale right now in the show notes for this episode. Otherwise, that is it for this week's interview episode. Please rate and review the show, whatever podcast app you listen to this on. Like, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications on YouTube so you don't miss out on any new video episodes. Sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack. Subscriptions start at just $5 a month. And as always, share the show on social media. It's Mims News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod on every platform. You can tag me. I'm at Granthermes on X and Bluesky, and at Granthermes TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Granthermes, and I'll talk to you next week.